What's going on, guys? Today we're going to be talking about the squat, and more specifically pause squats. Why should we do them? What are some of the benefits? We're going to go through 3 benefits as to why I think every lifter can benefit with at least one mesocycle here and there focusing on pause work. So the first benefit that comes along with adding pause work to your squats is positional awareness. I think as weight gets heavier, one of the toughest parts for lifters to really nail down and conquer is being consistent with their depth. This means that as weight gets super heavy, being able to control that load through the eccentric to concentric portion of the movement and not getting sunk in the bottom of the hole. If we're constantly dive bombing our squats or inconsistent with our depth, we can't expect to perform optimally, especially at higher intensities, because we're not going to have the cognizance of knowing exactly how to shift either our knees, hips, etc. forward or back based on where we are through space and time. Because we're inconsistent, we don't know exactly how to get ourselves out of potentially sticky situations. So by adding a pause at the bottom of your squats, you can focus on exactly where the bar position is in relation to your midfoot and also where the knees and hips are. Where do you need to be positioned to get the most bang for your buck with the prime movers? Since we're all built slightly differently and we all squat slightly differently, this is where adding a pause can be really great for focusing on the individuality of our squat. No 2 squats are going to look exactly the same, so by adding a pause, we can be hyper cognizant of what exactly we need to make sure we are optimally getting out of that bottom position and hitting the depth we need consistently at both lighter weights and heavier weights. And so the second benefit, and this kind of piggybacks off of positional awareness, is how pauses can actually translate to better eccentric and concentric patterns. So if we are adding pauses at the bottom of our squat and we're working with, let's say, a slower eccentric before we actually start that physical pause at the bottom, if we're pitched forward or if we're just sitting way too back, we're going to be very cognizant of that with that slower eccentric before we get into that pause position at the bottom, because we're going to feel off with our balance. Our body is then going to have to sequence itself to make up for that, which can then build our abilities to understand how we need to eccentrically load in the squat. How much of a knee and hip break do we need? Do we need it simultaneously at the top? Do we need to actually feed a little bit more in dorsiflexion at the top and have those knees really track? Do we need to sit back a little bit? How should we be eccentrically loading? And now to piggyback off of that, once we have eccentrically loaded properly, once we've paused, adding that pause can be a fantastic tool for helping you be cognizant of what you need to do to get out of that bottom position. So one of the toughest parts of the squat, which we all know, is coming out of the hole with a ton of intent and force through the ground. With a pause, we are going to be forced to focus on what our quads, adductors, and glutes are doing and how we sequence those to get ourselves out of that bottom position. So this is going to be great for helping us limit just passively sitting into the hole in our squat. We are going to have to be actively engaged. So we focus on that eccentric, getting down to that pause. We create a nice balanced position. Now, how do we drive through the ground to get ourselves back up? That is something that a pause can help us be hyper cognizant of, and especially as weight gets heavier and as we get way more specific with our training and progress in our training age, this is going to be key for long-term growth in the squat, because consistency is key and a squat is a skill. So by focusing again on the pause at the bottom, we are also going to get some byproduct benefit into the eccentric and concentric movement patterns for our squat too. The final benefit we'll discuss in this video is that pause squats can be a fantastic tool for increasing our training stimulus without necessarily adding a ton of load to the bar. So at times, load is not always the answer, especially when it comes to increasing a skill like the squat. So when we add pauses at the bottom, we've already talked about how they can increase positional awareness and actually strengthen our eccentric and concentric loading patterns by increasing our awareness with those. But what they can also do is they can increase the effort of our sets by making us focus on the quads, the hips, the adductors, what they're doing at the bottom of the squat and how they are facilitating our concentric movement pattern. So by doing this, we can have a mesocycle where we keep training intent high. We are very hyper focused on the skill of squatting, and we don't necessarily need to beat ourselves down with a ton of load. This is why I also love pause work, because when we're practicing skills like squats, deadlifts, bench press, always adding a ton of load and volume is not necessarily the answer. It's similar to a golf swing or any other sport-specific movement. A squat is a skill, and simply adding more weight, more volume is not always the answer. And this is why pause work and tempo work can be absolutely fantastic for building your abilities outside of just beating yourself down with a ton of load and a ton of volume on a weekly basis. So before we take this video out, I do want to give you some tips for adding pause work to your training. How should you add it in? How much loading should you do? How much volume, etc. We'll talk about it. So what I would suggest is starting with a mesocycle of pause work for your squat. So a 4 to 6 to 8 week mesocycle would be a really good bet. And then when it comes to sets and reps, I would say stick in the lower to mid-range rep range. So 1 to 5-ish reps are usually a really good bet. And then when it comes to overall loading and just overall set volume, loading wise, I would recommend sticking between like 60 to maybe 85%. And obviously there's gonna be an inverse relationship with the reps going up versus intensity here. So higher intensity, lower reps, lower intensity, we could add a little bit more of a higher rep scheme to that set. And then when it comes to sets, that's gonna scale based off of your abilities, but generally anywhere from like 3 to 6 can be a really good bet. And again, scale this based off of the context of your current program and your just overall training abilities. Don't obviously just go all out and drown yourself in volume and intensity on your first week and just absolutely sink yourself with pause squats. I would not recommend that. So ease into it and then work in like a linear fashion when it comes to the intensity and demand that these pause squats are going to demand from you on a week-to-week basis. So now when it comes to adding a tempo to your pause work, what I would suggest is a 2 to 3 second eccentric and then a 1 to 2 second pause at the bottom and then just a normal concentric movement pattern. And the reason I always recommend adding an eccentric tempo before the pause is because as we get into that pause positioning, if we're constantly dive bombing or inconsistent with our eccentric as we get more fatigued, for example, it can throw off our abilities to really hone in and nail that paused bottom position with consistency. Again, we are practicing a very specific part of the squat here. So how we get into this very specific part is important, just as important as the pause itself. So again, a 2 to 3 second eccentric tempo. So 1, 2, 3, pause for 1, 2, and then come back up. That's a really good bet. And what I would suggest too is to video yourself from the side and then also from a diagonal angle and watch at the bottom when you are pausing what the hips are doing. If you are pausing for a second and then dive bombing out of that hole, that could actually take away from some of the work we're trying to do. So try to limit going from more of like an active engaged positioning and then dropping to come out of the hole and bouncing out versus staying more engaged and then really fighting to maintain that engaged positioning and then start the concentric. By filming from the side and from more of a diagonal angle, we'll be able to really see what the hips are doing. And if we need to shift more emphasis into the quads, for example, or into the hips to make sure we're keeping our center of mass over our midfoot in order to be able to maintain a strong positioning without having to sink into the hole and then rely on our stretch reflex to get out. So those are some tips when it comes to programming pause squats. I think they're a fantastic tool, and honestly, I think way more people can use tempo and pauses for benefit, and just adding load and volume is not always the answer, especially when it comes to improving in skills like squats. But if you have any questions on this video or pause squats in general, hit me in the comments below. I would love to answer whatever you have. And as always, guys, drop a like on the video, drop subscribe to the channel. I'll see you guys in the next one.